All right. Welcome to Simple Healthy Life, where our goal is to have real, insightful conversations on topics that we find interesting. And MJ, today is going to be a good one.
Okay.
Today's going to be a good one because I think that it's going to be impossible for someone to listen to this conversation and not learn a lot.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And I know this. I guarantee it, actually.
Sweet.
Yeah. And we actually decided, MJ and I were kind of talking a little earlier in the week, and we were figuring, well, why don't we do some podcasts where we teach each other? And so on this one, I'll be talking a lot about the saturated fat and cardiac disease myths, and maybe we need to rethink about fat generally, reshape our narratives around fat. And I know that you're going to teach me something a little bit later too. So as a forewarning, this is going to be a nutrition dominated conversation, but I think it'll be a good one. And so the basic premise of this is that everything that we know about saturated fat and heart disease and the diet heart hypothesis is probably incorrect. And we're starting to get a lot of data now that suggests that is true, that it is incorrect, and that we need to start thinking about maybe a new paradigm of health. And I'm very excited to share more about this. But before we begin, what do you know about saturated fat?
Well, I'm going to be a great audience for you because I don't know much about it at all. What I was told, I think, is saturated fat was the stuff that clogs your arteries if you eat too much of it. And it's that fat that doesn't change color when you cook your meat. I like the taste of that. I'll just be perfectly transparent. And I mean, a little bit of label reading to see that that it's in other stuff but I'm not really that. I've never really been that up or down or concerned with it. I'd be guessing at the rest of the stuff. Maybe something to do with hydrogen, extra hydrogen in saturated fat. Is that potential?
It's in the ballpark.
Okay, cool.
Ballpark.
Maybe
Yeah, I mean, so saturated fat is this kind of like our solid fats, butter, meat fat, dairy fat, all these things that are like solid at room temperature. Okay. So that's a saturated fat. But yeah, you're exactly right. What they had told us since 1950s, this has been the hypothesis, emphasis on hypothesis since the 1950s. And the basic premise is that we've run with the hypothesis that saturated fat does clog our arteries. And so it's interesting. And so we're going to get into it. Looking back at like the early 1900s, what had happened was we started to see the rise in heart disease and heart attacks and cardiac issues in general. And it quickly rose to become the number one killer. And in fact, it still is.
So heart diseases was and still is the number one killer?
Was and still is, yes, exactly. It might be actually competing a little bit with cancer right now, so we'll have to double check that. But I'm pretty sure it's number one. So it's the health concern that everyone really should be kind of concerned about. If there is one, it's likely that. And so that's interesting. But this kind of fueled a lot of as you would imagine, a lot of efforts to say, well, how do we solve this? Because it was relatively, this is a fun fact, it was relatively unknown prior to 1900s. Like it quickly rose from early 1900s to like mid 1900s, 1950s or so. So that's very interesting. And so as this is rising and health officials and researchers are kind of getting into a tizzy about it, they start launching all these research studies and trying to figure out what this is. And lo and behold, they figure out, okay, well, what happens is our arteries get clogged with these plaques. And then that basically shuts off blood flow to the heart. heart gets damaged. If it happens in a severe amount or too frequently, then you have heart attacks. That's what that is, when there's not enough blood flow, and then the tissue starts dying. So it's a big problem. What they actually found out early on was that cholesterol was a major component of these plaques. So they would, do their research. They find, oh, these cholesterol molecules are part of plaque formation. And back in the early 1900s, they didn't really know anything about cholesterol. They just knew that there was this thing called cholesterol. It's basically this lipid fat kind of containing molecule, but they didn't know much about it. There was no distinctions. There was no healthy cholesterol, bad cholesterol. There was none of that. So then the early hypothesis came out, makes good intuitive sense. If you eat dietary cholesterol, then your blood cholesterol will rise and you'll have more plaques in your heart, essentially.
So what's cholesterol do for the body?
Yeah, so cholesterol does a number of things, and I'm going to kind of do like a little bit of a deeper dive in a little bit.
Okay.
But cholesterol is found only in animal products, so it's purely animal based, whereas like plant based stuff has plant sterols. Animal based products, including us, we're an animal based product, I suppose. We have cholesterol, and cholesterol is highly functional. It's a very important molecule, actually. It's used in a number of different functions: hormone regulation, digestion, energy kind of needs, nutrient carrying around, essentially. And we do find it in foods, obviously, because as we eat meat and eggs and all that kind of stuff, we see, you can even see it on the nutrition facts. It says cholesterol in the nutrition facts. So the early hypothesis, the very first one, makes perfect intuitive sense, right? It's like a third grader could put that together. Well, if cholesterol is part of these plaques and that's really bad, then if you eat it, then you're going to have more of that, and makes good sense. The problem is his body's a little bit more complicated than that, but it didn't really matter. So what they started doing is, okay, now we're going to focus on cholesterol. Let's feed. They did some early studies where they fed these rabbits with a bunch of cholesterol. Give these rabbits a bunch of cholesterol and see what happens.
Hold on. So silly question. Third grader again. Yes. Rabbits eat vegetables?
Yes.
And we gave them a bunch of animal products?
Yes.
Okay. Just follow it. Never mind. Maybe I was wrong there.
No, this is perfect. So you give something that's an herbivore cholesterol, which is purely animal product, and you can, lo and behold, lesions, plaques.
That didn't work for them.
Didn't work. Started to fuel this, like, whoa, yeah, well, look what happened when we gave rabbits all this dietary cholesterol. Like, this is bad news. In the background there, and I say a lot of these, we're going to be talking a lot of studies, and there are a lot of studies that happen kind of in the background of mainstream science and mainstream headlines and news. But in the background here, other researchers are picking up that same third grade observation and saying, well, what happens if we give dietary cholesterol to dogs, omnivores? Nothing happens. Okay, fair enough. So we're in a tizzy about dietary cholesterol. Now what they start doing is they start doing human studies on dietary cholesterol. And actually, lo and behold, there was no way to raise a human's cholesterol level with a ton of dietary cholesterol. So this is actually this is so surprising. We've known since actually the early 1950s, and this has been accepted, whereas some of these other things we're going to talk about is not widely accepted. This has been accepted that eating cholesterol doesn't raise a human's blood cholesterol level. Isn't that very interesting?
Well, I've had plenty of people that I've offered my own diet to, and when I tell them that I eat 4 or 5 eggs in the morning, the first thing they say is, oh, I can't do that. That would raise my cholesterol.
80 plus years, we've been solid on that. Everyone in health research has been solid. Nutrition research has known that to be the case, that the human digestive tract regulates cholesterol very well. So cholesterol goes in the digestive tract. If you have enough, you excrete it. but yet this is still like a pervasive myth. Again, maybe because it, the intuition maybe makes sense there. Like, okay, I eat cholesterol, I get more cholesterol. But the human body is very complicated, and this is where we start seeing issues. It's like the beliefs that we have that translate into this like kind of like misbeliefs, the cultural kind of beliefs, cultural health beliefs, and that is one of them. I saw it just the other day. I'm like, I'm formulating, I'm writing my narrative on this podcast, and I see a comment on Facebook on a friend. It's like, I couldn't eat those eggs. I'm going to raise my cholesterol. I'm like, we're in 2025. Like, we should know this by now. So for the record, and this is undisputed, eating dietary cholesterol has no impact on our serum blood cholesterol at all. So
wow. So
yes.
Eat the eggs.
Eat the eggs.
Not the egg whites. Don't have to worry about it. Just eat.
Yeah, eat the eggs.
Okay.
So
sweet.
So very interesting, and yet, we still have these kinds of narratives from the early 1950s saying, well, cholesterol is this biological rust. Like, if you have too much, it's so dangerous. Like, we gotta lower this at all costs. And so, basically, what we had now, we needed to figure out, because we've established, okay, humans eating cholesterol doesn't necessarily raise blood cholesterol. So what does? Enter saturated fat as a new hypothesis. And this hypothesis was really kind of, I guess, streamlined by Ancel Keys. Do you know Ancel Keys, perchance?
I think you brought him up on a podcast recently, but only through what you've talked about.
Yeah. So he was this. Probably
great name, by the way.
Yeah. Maybe that's why he's so popular. But he is. I mean, for a 1950s nutrition researcher to still be somewhat of a household name, I mean, that speaks a little bit to his like notoriety. In some sense, I mean, he was a really popular kind of guy, and he was actually like on Time magazine, and he was just like the picture of nutrition research back then. And in fact, he had quite a history of nutrition research. He had involvement in a very popular starvation study called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, where as the name deems, they starved humans, and they actually found out a lot by it. Back then, there was no like ethical kind of consideration, so starvation was on the the green list of things that we could do. But nonetheless, this is still data that I refer to. So I mean, it's quality data to see this, like what happens in the starving human body. Maybe we'll do another podcast on that specifically. What they found out really was that when humans starve, bad things happen. So,
this just in.
Yeah. Notably psychologic, like bad psychologic issues. So that's kind of interesting. But nonetheless, so here's this like very charismatic, very popular, very intelligent nutrition researcher, and he jumps on the scene with a new hypothesis that if you eat saturated fat, this raises cholesterol, and this causes heart disease. And so this was the predominant theory then. And so we still run on this hypothesis. This is the accepted hypothesis from the majority of health professionals to this day. And so that's kind of actually interesting. You think, wow, a nutrition theory from 1950s where they didn't even know about cholesterol. They didn't know there was distinctions. They didn't even have the science to distinguish between cholesterol. That theory still remains.
I mean, in my brain, there's not a ton of things that have passed that test for 75 years.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that caused that to keep the narrative going?
Yeah, great question. So there was a number of studies produced by Ancel Keys, which were fair. There was some good data there, but the problem is that we actually have this story now, and we're going to get into it, where researchers fell in love with their hypothesis, and this superseded science. And one of the most popular studies actually that came out from Ancel Keys is called the 7 Nations or 7 Countries study. And this was, we're about like 1960s here, mid 1960s. And the 7 Nations study basically took a bunch of different countries, did some dietary analysis on the folks in these countries. Ancel Keys himself went here and kind of like put together all this research. It was a big to do. And what they found was that in these 7 countries, the people who actually ate the highest amount of saturated fat had the actual highest risk of cardiac disease. Interesting, right? And so that was the overwhelming message taken from these studies, is that if you ate high saturated fat, then you're likely going to be at cardiac risk. And so it makes perfect sense. Actually, 7 Nations study is one of the most popular cited studies in, I think, probably history. It has over 1 million research citations, which is phenomenally grand,
Yeah,
that's a huge.
Well, that would go a long way in keeping the narrative.
Exactly.
I mean, if you got 1 million people citing it,
Exactly.
they're going to be disseminating that information to billions of people.
Right. So the problems, though, there were significant problems, and I don't know if we can use our third grader logic here. 7 countries out of however many we have now. And in fact, when some of this research started to take place, which was in 1955, there was 22 countries who like publicly collected this kind of health data. And so why not use all 22 countries that had this public health data available for researchers? And this is where things start to get a little sketchy, is that it appeared to be that Ancel Keys actually cherry-picked some data, cherry-picked countries that seemed to fit the hypothesis. And I actually have a graph here that I'm going to show you, and we're going to put up on the screen here. But when you actually add in the 22 countries to this data set, you actually see something very interesting. And so as you look on this x-axis, the x-axis further to the right here, we're actually having the highest saturated fat intake, and on the y-axis, we're looking at cardiac mortality. And so if you can like take a look at this, you're going to see that on the far right side, there are plenty of countries that actually eat plenty of saturated fat. The saturated fat is predominantly a big part of their diet, where they actually have low cardiac mortality. This is where we get the French paradox. We've talked a little bit about that on this podcast. The French paradox, the idea of eating saturated fat, that's paradoxical. But it's not a paradox if France and Germany and Italy and all these other countries seem to, actually I don't know if Italy is one of them, but nonetheless, all these other countries seem to eat high amounts of saturated fat in line with the U.S. The U.S. was like slightly more. And yet their cardiac mortality risk is far lower than the U.S.
So are you saying that it appears as though he set out to prove his hypothesis versus test his hypothesis?
That's what it appears to be, yeah. I think there are good intentions with a lot of this data. I think people have just, it appears to be one of these things where, and we're gonna even find out more about this, but it appears to be one of these things where the hypothesis was accepted before proven, and then science is conducted with this idea that the hypothesis is true without mechanistic data, without correlational data, cherry-picked correlational data, without clinical trials, which are very well-controlled trials. It was accepted before all that, and then data was either esteemed or deemed disappointing if it didn't. And that's a quote. Like if these studies actually didn't seem to uphold this hypothesis, it was called disappointing. And in fact, even more sketchy behavior, some of the disappointing results was buried, unpublished. And so back to the Seven Nations study, actually only less than 4% of the people within this data set had their diets evaluated, which is a problem nonetheless. You're drawing nutritional conclusions here, and only 4% of the population actually had dietary evaluations done, and they're sketchy dietary evaluations. This is like the problem with nutrition science. It really is hard to get good data because people don't know what they eat. What'd you eat yesterday? It's like such a hard task. I ask that question multiple times every day to people, and it's like it's a slog to get through that. And I'm an experienced person who's asked hundreds and hundreds of people, what did you eat yesterday? And I can guide them through that. Never mind Joe Schmo, who's like, what did you eat yesterday? And they have no idea how to like actually conduct that kind of interview. So the data is way off on that front. Some of the countries that they actually pulled from, this is like a huge oversight, they did some dietary evaluations during Lent, when people gave up meat, eggs, dairy. So like a third of, one of the countries, a third of that data was totally invalid because it was happening during Lent. So yeah, problem. And that was seen to be as an oversight, but didn't seem to like actually register very much on the researchers' front.
This might be a question, I don't know if you know the answer, but when did we introduce the ability to do blood samples that kind of told us the stuff?
Like blood work, like lab work?
Yeah, like I did my blood work and I got my cholesterol number or my this or my that. Was it post 1955?
So I believe in 1955 they would do serum blood cholesterol levels, but there was no distinction between HDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, VLDL. There was no distinction between the different subcategories of cholesterol. So what they really looked at for a lot of this data was total cholesterol, and we still look at total. If you get like your lipid panel done, you'll see total cholesterol as like a marker, but it doesn't tell us much. It just tells us the total cholesterol levels, and in fact, what they find is that the distinctions are really, really important. So again, most of this data was done pre-distinction, and so it's almost completely invalid because we don't actually know what the composition of the cholesterol even looked like.
So I know we're talking mostly about saturated fat and fat, but you started off by talking about heart disease, and one thing that I was told is that heart disease is genetic. Is that real? Is that a thing that I don't understand the concept of heart disease being genetic. Like, do you have a flaw with your, like, can you unpack that a little bit? Or
yeah. It's probably likely that there are some genetic factors that make a person more at risk for those types of things. But I'm actually, I actually have some good data on maybe how atherosclerosis forms, and that will be more speculative. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that.
Okay.
So nonetheless, within this data set, actually what is kind of funny, the Seven Nations, is that even in the higher fat diet group, mortality was unchanged, which is a common theme for a lot of these studies, is that actually what they find is that perhaps saturated fat does actually raise LDL cholesterol, but the biggest problem is that in almost all of these studies, well cited by diet heart hypothesis individuals, mortality is never better in these groups. So what is the point of even making these changes if mortality is unchanged? And so we're going to get a little bit more into that too. And in fact, in the Seven Nation data set, can you make a guess as to actually what nutrient was more correlated to heart disease?
Oh, what nutrient was more correlated to heart disease? Well, they were testing for the percentage of diet that was animal product.
They were looking at all nutrients.
All nutrients. No, go.
Refined carbohydrates had a higher correlation coefficient than fat itself, and this was missed.
Did you say the word refined?
Yes.
Oh, well, then there you go. Problem solved.
Yeah, and it's this simple kind of thing, right? It's like, they tunnel visioned on saturated fat, missing the fact that in a lot of these studies, refined carbohydrates are more correlated to this. And just as a disclaimer, I do have a couple individuals who listen to us and listen to these podcasts and who might be struggling with like disorder type eating, and so there's a little bit of a trigger warning in some sense, because we're going to be diving into things that may or may not be super great to listen to if we kind of get obsessive on some of these topics. But the point being is that balance is always key. No foods are inherently bad. It's just we need appropriate balance, and that's a skill that we can work on. So that's there. Anyways, so yeah, 7-nation study, most well cited study yet. Big problems, and this is a theme. And so now introduce Ancel Keys as this like very like, wow, he did this big study, like look at the data, like saturated fat's so bad, and so he became the poster boy for saturated fat. He actually then advocated that people reduce their saturated fat percentage of the diet down to as far as 2%. So eat 2% saturated fat or less, right? And comically enough, he was always seen eating like eggs and bacon. And
I'll be fine.
Yeah. It's like, I'm different. But nonetheless,
so this charismatic guy comes out, does this thing, kind of by, the graph you showed me, kind of cherry picks the data. I think that in the 1950s, if you labeled something a 7-nation study, you're going to get a lot of people that are like, whoa, he must have done a lot of research here, right? I mean, 7 nations now is like, all right, just go to ChatGPT and figure that out. But back then, I imagine you have to do a lot of like legwork and travel and, corresponding, and then add in the fact that this guy, by your account, was very charismatic and like on the cover of magazines. And you take people that are now already feeling a level of concern around diet, put it on the cover of Time magazine, throw open an article that's 2 pages long that says exactly what they want it to say, and now you get scared people.
Yeah. Here's a problem. Everyone knows a person who's had a heart attack. We don't have enough data about health in general. And then here's this guy saying, I did all this work. He did do a lot of work. You can't take that away from him. He was like in it, and he was really like peddling this hypothesis. And, I think all good intentions, but just kind of misled a little on his own beliefs here. And so he actually, he became an advisor for the American Heart Association. And so they enter the American Heart Association, who still is a very kind of like pervasive organization right now. They still make these recommendations. They still have a big say in how our healthcare and nutrition community operate. And fun fact, the American Heart Association in the early 1900s was relatively unknown. It was still kind of like trying to get its feet in the door here, and as any organization requires, you do need a little bit of help on this front, a little bit of funding front. One guess as to like what company might have funded this American Heart Association.
Oh boy, in the 1950s-ish?
Yeah.
I'm going to say somebody that makes a refined product.
Ding, ding, ding. Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble being like one of the biggest big food companies on the planet. They provided them about $1.7 million in funding to basically start up their whole, the whole organization. And 1.7 million back then is roughly 20 to 25 million in today's kind of equivalent. So a lot of money. interesting. Now we start bringing in these kind of like conspiratorial kind of like angles, and I'm not trying to get conspiracy. I'm just like, these are facts, you know, just straight up facts. You guys can check all of this out. I've done the research and I've double checked myself to make sure that this is very accurate, and unfortunately it is. So Ancel Keys and this now newly funded American Heart Association start teaming up and start saying, well, we have to really prove this. Like, we have some correlational data, but let's really prove, and let's like, we kind of believe it, so let's start transitioning people off saturated fat, because what can go wrong? Like, I guess the thought there is like, if we start reducing saturated fat, like nothing bad is going to happen. We think we vilified it, but what could go wrong? The problem is that you need a replacement for saturated fat. You need fat in your diet, and in fact, people don't like the taste of food that doesn't have some fat in it. And so their recommendations actually were in 1961 to remove all saturated fat and replace it with none other than corn and soybean oil. And, you know, it's comical because we kind of can understand that this is, you know, no good. But it's actually funny because, and then I started diving into the research around that time. And there's a study from 1965, I believe it, and it is. And this is just 4 years after these like formal recommendations. And I'm just going to read this. In a 2-year randomized trial of 80 patients with ischemic heart disease, those receiving corn oil alongside reduced animal fat had the lowest survival rate and highest heart attack rate at 52%, compared to actually the olive oil group, which is at 57% of reduced survival, and the corn oil at 75% reduced survival rate. And so although serum cholesterol levels fell in the corn oil group, the worst clinical outcomes were unlikely due to chance. The authors concluded that corn oil should not be recommended for treatment of ischemic heart disease in 1965, the British Medical Journal. So, yeah, we know they had this data out there, but it's again this kind of like background data that I mentioned before. It's like it's not mainstream, so people aren't accepting it. And these people, including healthcare researchers, professionals, nutrition professionals. In fact, in 1965, one of the major nutrition scientists at the time called a low carbohydrate diet as a recommendation the equivalent of mass murder. So if you
Really?
so eat high carbohydrates because that's the way forward, and if you recommend low carbohydrates, then you're this is mass murder.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Wow.
Yeah. So then after all these, especially the American Heart Association's on board, what do they start doing? Everything's pivoting off of saturated fat. We have to remove saturated fat, and we got to start making these new low-fat products, and we kind of experienced a little bit of this growing up. I know a lot of our listeners experienced the low-fat craze, and in fact, what you've actually found in a period of time, in that period of time, and we're kind of like in the late 1960s now, is that when you remove saturated fat from processed products, cookies, cakes, crackers, whatever, you have a big problem because oils don't provide the structure necessary for a good tasting product, right? Same reason why you just can't like get rid of butter in a batch of cookies that you make, because it just doesn't work. Oil is not a fair substitute, and if you do, then it's just a bad cookie. So then that's a real dilemma, and they say, well, what can we do? What can we do now that we've lost the structural integrity of saturated fat? Saturated fat's so bad, and we want to get rid of this from the general population. Well, why don't we take these oils, soybean oil, canola oil, corn oil, why don't we take these and hydrogenate them? And what they actually did was they made a trans fat, and trans fat is an oil that was given additional hydrogens. So, and kind of to your point before, given additional hydrogens, either fully or partially, and now it has the same structural integrity of a saturated fat.
And it's supposed to work differently in the body?
And so they thought, well, these are now these vegetable oils, super healthy for us. We just gave them some hydrogens and all is good. And now, what a dream.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, what a dream. Take a guess at who patented the first to market trans fat, commercial trans fat.
Well, it certainly couldn't be Procter & Gamble. That would be silly.
Ding, ding, ding. Procter & Gamble, the first patents on Crisco. Interesting. So now we're starting to see like the nefarious, potentially kind of.
Well, hold on a second. Let's not call them nefarious. It sounds like they were trying to save the world.
It's one of those things where you can't necessarily hate a company for wanting to promote its products. I think it's fair, and so nothing on these companies. I just think that, as someone who deals with research and nutrition and healthcare, you have to remain open to the fact that everything that you know could be wrong. And this is something that people come to me and say, well, Ryan, like, there's so much nutrition information out there. I don't know what's right, what's wrong. Eggs are good one day, they're bad the next day, this and that, and carbs are not good, and then they're good. And, it's a problem because on one hand, things are changing all the time. But on the other hand, we're starting to see some of these patterns, this background research has been very alive and well. It's just not hoisted to the forefront.
So I'm reminded of this, and maybe I'm getting off track for 1 second, but I'm reminded of this day, and I know I talked to you about it, where I did this presentation, and I had all these numbers and all these stats, and I delivered this presentation to basically like the top of the top. Mm-hmm. And at the end, they said, good job, that's really great. And one person looked at me afterwards, and she pulled me aside, and she goes, what was the denominator in all those numbers? And I didn't intentionally leave it out, but it didn't help my argument. And I remember thinking to myself, that's something that's so simple nowadays for people to just give you these stats and these facts and just leave out the denominator. Like, for example, your stats around like how much better Crisco or how much better this new product they developed was over, X, Y, and Z, but they never actually. They're not going to publish what it would be like if you just ate animal fat and protein and vegetables and whatever the case may be. So right. I think in our today's media leaves out the denominator in everything. And people get so fired up off of this crazy stat where they really aren't actually understanding the full scope, whether it's a tiny scope or a broad scope, because it doesn't help their argument.
Right. No, that's a great point. Lacking the denominator is such an important point. And yeah, I mean, this was the case for a lot of these studies, and I'm just going to review a couple of these too. One of so American Heart Association, and they start promoting trans fat and all these things. Healthcare professionals promoted trans fat, which is the worst healthcare mistake. In fact, it took them 90 years. It took the FDA 90 years to actually, from the inception of trans fat onto the market, for them to actually say, ooh, this is terrible. And this is well known now. They now know that trans fats are like probably the worst nutrient that someone could eat. It's man-made fat. It's highly toxic.
So check me on this, and we can look it up. Actually, maybe even have God look it up if you want. I was told that you are allowed to, according to the FDA, you're allowed to put 0 trans fats on the front of your box, even if as long as there's under 1 gram per serving of trans fats in your product.
Yep.
Meaning you could actually, you don't have to have no trans fats.
Yep.
And say there's no trans fats. That's how people know they're not good for you, but they're still in your food.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, and I think that might have changed in recent years. I'm not entirely sure about that. There's something in my head that says that might have changed. But generally on the nutrition facts label, if it's under 1 gram or 0.5 grams, then they can omit that from the label. It still needs to be in the ingredients list, but it doesn't need to be listed on the facts label. And so that's where there is some trickery. Why would that be?
Tell me why that would be. Give me like a non-nefarious reason for that.
There is. I mean, I can't. I mean, maybe because in some cases it's negligible, but the problem is that it's almost always strategic, because what they do then is, if it were to be a negligible amount, what do? Then you lower the serving size so that the serving size can demonstrate that there's no trans fat or saturated fat or whatever, sugar, for example.
Like 3 Oreos is a serving.
yeah, or like 1, and then they're like nothing in it, right? It's like actually I was watching this. I was stuck on a meme train for a little bit, and I saw this one where the caption was, "When you're on a diet," and it's a dude in front of a food scale, and he places like 1 chip on the food scale, and it says
one at a time,
0, and he's like, nothing, and he eats it. He's just going back and forth. But it's kind of like that. It's literally like that. So trans fat now being well promoted, like, eat this, it saves lives, and this is also on magazines at the time too, like, please, and so we kind of like caught the back end of this. However, so now the American Heart Association says, well, let's prove this once and for all, and they start getting all this funding, and this is not exactly nefarious or sketchy, but a lot of the funding for these studies does come from like Frito-Lay and Quaker and General Mills. Like, it just kind of is the way it is. A lot of these research, and this is still true, but a lot of these places, they're not generating a ton of money, and in fact, the food companies are, and so it's kind of a symbiotic relationship in some sense. But again, if you don't produce results that maybe align with their company, why are they going to fund you? Well, why is a company going to? And it's a money thing, it's not, again, not really nefarious, but if General Mills can provide some funding and, look, whatever, our product is actually pretty good, low in saturated fat, blah, blah, blah. It's like, it's in alignment with what the researchers say. Makes sense. So,
well, right around this time, 60s, 70s, isn't this when we started to recognize that smoking was bad, and a lot of these people that own the smoking companies then realized that they needed to pivot to something, and they bought the food companies.
Yeah. Well, some of the biggest deals in history were the tobacco companies buying the food companies right around this time, and perfect segue, because what they actually launched and one of the big massive studies, they were trying to get it much bigger, but they kind of failed at this like feasibility study where they tried to prove this diet heart hypothesis. So and then what they said is, we're going to take this hundreds of millions of dollars, and we're going to break this up into a couple different studies, and let's study this for all, once and for all. And so what they came up was with the MRFIT study, and it was an acronym. It just means multiple risk factor intervention trial. And this is a conundrum of a study, and so you guys can look this up, but it's very interesting. It's a very large one, 12,000 high risk men. They had really high elevated cholesterol levels. They told them, okay, half of you guys live life normally, eat your saturated fat, smoke, do all the bad things. It's a multiple risk intervention. So they looked at smoking and blood pressure and also diet. So they took half of them and said, you do your thing, we'll look at you over time. The other half, they said, okay, you're going to quit smoking, you're going to take blood pressure meds, and you're going to eat a low-fat diet, primarily, and polyunsaturated fats, margarines, all that kind of stuff. After 7 years, paradoxically, the intervention group, the group that quit smoking, ate the lower fat diet, et cetera, they actually had slightly higher mortality than the control group. So that's kind of interesting.
Slightly higher mortality.
Yeah. So the people who actually quit smoking at higher rates, 21% in the intervention group versus 6% quit naturally in the control group, they actually still died at higher rates, which is very interesting. More paradoxically, in the follow-up in 1997 to the same data set, they actually found that the people with the intervention who were told to quit smoking and to eat a low-fat diet and take the blood pressure meds actually had more lung cancer, a higher prevalence of lung cancer versus the control group. And that's so paradoxical because 21% in that group quit smoking versus 6% in the control. So where does that come from? And so I found that kind of interesting. I don't know what to make of that. And that was kind of like the thought around that time too, is like, they're doing all these things that are definitely, well, I mean, aside from the diet stuff, but smoking, they know that to be terrible, yet seems like it didn't really make much of a difference in that data set. And not to say that smoking is...
What's the denominator? How big is this group? You said
12,000, yeah.
Okay.
So 6,000 control versus...
Okay.
Yeah, and they all had elevated cholesterol too. And so that is another thing. They had one of the hypotheses now disproven was that the people in the control group, intervention group, were taking blood pressure meds, and they thought, well, maybe these diuretics are toxic. Maybe they're not great, but that was disproven. They're not necessarily toxic. So interesting stuff. And this is a recurring theme, that these studies reveal these like quote unquote paradoxical effects. But it's not paradoxical if it just happens all the time. Similar to like what we talked about, the French paradox. They eat high saturated fat, and these are not paradoxes. It's just science. It's just the data, and we label things as like, whoa, that doesn't make sense. Well, throw that data set out, and that's what they do. In the Framingham study, this is another big study. I went to the college, the university that like was a part of this, and what they found was that men with cholesterol less than 190, this is total cholesterol still at this time, had 3 times the risk of colon cancer than those with higher cholesterol levels above 220. They found that there was no strong correlation between women with high cholesterol and mortality. One of these Japanese studies actually found that men with less than 180 total cholesterol had 2 to 3 times higher stroke risk, which is another common theme, that stroke appears to kind of come up as cholesterol comes down. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then now we're getting into late 1968, 1973, the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. This is like the data. This was supposed to be the study that proved everything once and for all. This was the big granddaddy of diet heart studies. It still is the largest ever double-blind randomized clinical trial on this hypothesis. And
it still is from 1968 till now. Okay.
It was 9,000 men and women, and very, very well controlled. This is what makes this probably the most compelling data set, is that they took people in Minnesota who were in like psychiatric hospitals and nursing homes. And if you know anything about these places, which I happen to, because I've had a background in these kind of like state-run and otherwise run facilities, is that their diets are hyper-controlled. You know, you get 3 meals, three squares a day, and that's really it. You know, they should be giving them snacks, and they do give them snacks and all that, but you're not getting a lot of food on the inside. People aren't, family members aren't bringing a ton of food in. In fact, there's a lot of regulations around that, so it's a hassle. So this was like very well controlled. So they got their meals directly intervened with, and what they did is they split them both up. One group of these people were eating traditional American diet, high in butter, high in lard, and all these kinds of things. In the intervention group was they replaced saturated fats with these polyunsaturated fats, so corn oil, margarine, soybean oil, et cetera, et cetera. What happened was, and this is interesting, and again, we're going to come back to this. So the intervention group, the low saturated fat people, they actually had their serum cholesterol reduced by 14%. And that was the only data point that actually made it through, right? So, reduced saturated fat, like lower cholesterol, great. Not great, because actually when you kind of look deeper, you find that there was no reduction in heart attacks or stroke. You find that there was no reduction in total mortality. In fact, you saw those who had the greatest reduction in cholesterol had higher mortality risks.
Wow.
If you reduced your cholesterol more, you died quicker. And these other kind of committees actually looked at this data afterwards, subgroup analysis, and they found that it was potentially a harmful study, that they actually harmed these people through their interventions. This data set was suppressed. This data set was not published. They only published partial amounts of this data set. And it was, keep in mind, this was 1970. They didn't receive, the full data set wasn't published until 2016.
Wow.
2016, Christopher Ramsden, a National Health Institute researcher, had to go into like the archives and publish provide a reanalysis to this data, and found that for every 30 milligrams per deciliter drop in cholesterol, there was a 22% higher risk of death.
Wow.
Isn't that remarkable?
Wow.
Isn't that remarkable? Yeah. And so the researchers, the people who put this together, called their data disappointing. What does that even mean? How can you be disappointed with the data? Data is data.
Well, disappointing that they're not going to get any more funding. You guys did it wrong. Clearly.
Yeah.
It doesn't prove what we wanted you to prove.
Right.
So let's just publish page 1 and 2.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what happened. And this is, again, a theme.
I know we're talking about fat, and I don't want to speak out of school because I don't know, but I keep correlating the story you're telling me with the current story that we have about sugar versus artificial sweeteners. Mm-hmm. Like sugar bad, artificial sweetener good. You know, Coke bad, Diet Coke good. Like, it just feels to me like there could be a lot of this stuff going on.
Yeah, I think that's what we have to be careful about. We have to be careful about, and I had this, as I was like doing this data, I had this thought, and I actually even wrote it down, and I said, you know, we have to be really careful about vilifying anything, because we vilify saturated fat. What is the rebound effect that happens? Well, we need a replacement, and the replacement is likely very dangerous, and I'm going to get into that into a second as to how it's actually likely very dangerous. And the same thing with, you know, carbohydrates now is going to get kind of like in the crosshairs, and it's very easy to say carbohydrates are so bad, let's replace it with something else. What are you replacing it with? Okay, and so we have to be very, very careful of that. You know, you can't just take things out, and the replacements, to your point, the replacements to these things, you know, they're new. How do we know what happens? We don't know enough about the body. People don't know enough about the body. And still to this day, they don't know how atherosclerosis happens. We're going to get into like a little bit of that, and that's very interesting. And I'll do a we're diving deep warning before we get there, but let's just kind of run through this too. One of the other big studies is the Sydney Diet Heart Study. Really quickly, they replaced saturated fat in the intervention group versus the control group. They replaced saturated fat with polyunsaturated oils, corn oil, safflower oil, all these, you know, other kind of seed and vegetable oils. 62% increase in the risk of death in the intervention group. 62%. They were removing the killer. This is the 1970s. Also not published until decades later, the Sydney Heart Study. You can look this up. Women's Health Initiative, huge study. They took people, this is like so sad. They took women who previously suffered a heart attack. One group, do your thing. The other group, low saturated fat diet. Guess what happens? The intervention group had 25% higher risk of heart attacks. And on the subsequent follow-up many years later, 46% increased risk of heart attacks in the intervention group. This is harm. This is harm done to these folks, and this is harm done on a large scale. When you look at this data, it's sad.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it must have been pretty easy to get away with in the 70s.
Yeah, who's going to double check you?
Right. You just publish what you publish. You don't what you don't. Mm. You get paid to publish the stuff that makes you money.
Right.
And it does seem like that hasn't changed.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, like, you know, a lot of this still, like it's weird for me to talk about. And this upcoming little bit is weird for me to talk about because it's paradoxical to even what I was taught. I was taught saturated fat was bad.
People ask me all the time, do you drink low-fat milk or regular or whole milk? Mm-hmm. Not people ask. It's not a very common question, but I do get it more often than you think. And I always say I drink both because in my house we had my mom, who was like, "Oh, we got to drink low-fat milk," and Ron was like, "Well, I don't know why you would drink that stuff. It tastes like crap." And so we had them both. So it's just interesting because it seems to me like from what you're saying, like there's no value in that.
You can't absorb actually the calcium from low-fat milk because the fat is required to absorb calcium in an efficient manner. In fact, low-fat dairy creates these insoluble soaps that disrupt calcium absorption. So
like low-fat yogurt, low-fat. What's the other word I'm looking for? Like cheese is no good.
We're going full fat, and here's why. So
it's good for me because I like the full fat stuff. I just did,
which is great, right? Because full fat things just taste better, and they're more satiating too. And you end up actually eating less of other things when you get the full fat version, which is again is why it's not only that that this is potentially a harmful intervention, is that it's harmful. It's harmful on a scale that we can't possibly imagine because of how humans naturally operate. And so, as a fair warning here, we're going to get just a little bit deeper into some science stuff, and this is where it gets me really excited because it's super cool. So we have maybe 3 types of fats that we're concerned with. We have saturated fats, which all fats have this kind of glyceride kind of component to it, chemically speaking, and then a long chain of carbon, right? It's just carbon, 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 carbon. And this long chain is what distinguishes between saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. In a saturated fat, we see this chain that's nice, long, structured, and has no chemical double bonds. The thing that's relevant about a double bond is a weak bond. It's something that is kind of loose, right? It's like, it's like this loose little handshake that the carbons aren't really holding on to each other. They're just kind of loosely connecting.
In a double bond.
In a double bond. And so saturated fat has no double bond. This is why when you look at butter and meat and cheese, it's solid.
It holds together well.
Yeah, structural integrity.
That makes good sense.
And lays flat. The saturated fat lays flat upon itself. It structures tightly and nice and packed. Monounsaturated fat has one double bond, hence mono. And what that does is it places one double bond within the chain, and each double bond is a little kinked, and so it doesn't lay flat anymore. There's a little kink in the chain, and it now lays as basically an oil. And same thing with polyunsaturated, which has 2 or more double bonds.
So can you give me an example of a monosaturated fat?
Yeah, like avocado is one, or surprisingly, like a chicken or duck fat, like a poultry fat, is a monounsaturated. It's predominantly the predominant fats that we see in nature are saturated and monounsaturated. We don't really see high amounts of polyunsaturated fats.
Okay. So, okay, I'm following.
Yep. Okay. Polyunsaturated has 2 double bonds or more, very weak bonds.
Likely to be a liquid at room temperature?
Definitely is an oil.
Okay.
And so that's like corn, soy, bean oil, canola, safflower, peanut. Within this, we also have omega-3s. Omega-3s are an interesting one because they're an outlier in a lot of this other kind of polyunsaturated equation. So we're going to focus a little bit on this because it's relevant, because saturated fat, no double bonds, structurally sound. It's very difficult to oxidize, okay? And by oxidation, what that means is it doesn't break up very easily. If you think about cooking and you use some oil and then you heat it up a little too high, what happens? It smokes, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the smoking point, but this is also, when it smokes, it starts actually oxidizing, breaking apart. These double bonds break apart and start forming other compounds, potentially very damaging compounds. But this is why if you look at the smoke point kind of list, you'll find butter and ghee and tallow and all these other things very, very high. They can tolerate high amounts of heat because they're structurally sound.
Okay, makes sense.
oils, especially some of them, especially have very low smoke points, and then those are very unstable. They have multiple double bonds. They just break off and cause all these other compounds, and that is really relevant. Okay, so cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. What is that? Cholesterol is a complex molecule that basically holds fat components in it, right? And so you can think about it as this like transport kind of bus. It buses the fats along to different tissues within the body. LDL cholesterol has been demonized as this like terrible, bad, terrible thing. But the more complex distinction here is that only oxidized LDL contributes to cardiac disease. So oxidized, damaged LDL.
Okay.
As they look into these atherosclerotic kind of plaques, what they actually find is it's not necessarily just LDL. It's oxidized LDL, and in fact, it's oxidized LDL that has been consumed by a macrophage. And so a macrophage is these like the quintessential immune system compound. And so what it does is it targets sickness. It targets things that are damaging, right? And so we think about this as like the number one like immune system functioning molecule in the body. And so what it does is it marks things as bad and then it consumes it. They've done plenty of studies, and these are like studies by like Nobel, the kind of like Nobel scientists, Nobel award winnings. And what they find is that when they have plain LDL in a petri dish with a macrophage, they actually find that the macrophage won't target and consume this LDL. It only targets and consumes this LDL when this LDL has been damaged and oxidized. And why is that? They think it's because if this LDL is oxidized and damaged, what is in it is damaged fats, right? These oxidized fats. And this is very, very dangerous because these oxidized fats called lipid peroxides have free flow through the body. They can go through any tissue, they can go through any cell, and they can cause damage. And we talked about free radicals before. These free radicals are these damaging compounds. This is one of them. This is one of them to a high, high degree. So in the body, the macrophage targets these oxidized LDL, eats it, and starts to grow. This becomes what's known as a foam cell. And a foam cell appears to be, and this is kind of like, well, now we're going to get into like speculation, and this is not like, this is strong facts in some sense, but it mechanistically is still speculation. The foam cell appears to be the major driver of atherosclerosis. And so these foam cells, which are these macrophages that consumed these damaged LDL particles, appear to be the fundamental component of these plaques. And in fact, when they look at people who have cardiac disease, they find up to 100 times more oxidized LDL in their blood than someone without. So it seems to be highly, highly correlated. These foam cells, they call them foam cells because within the macrophage, if you take a look at it, it's these little LDL damaged molecules that look like foamy. They look like air pockets almost. So that's what they call it, foam cell. It looks foamy. These actually release a lot of like pro-inflammatory proteins or cytokines, and this can be measured. And in fact, they know that this is also strong data. They know that CRP, this like inflammatory marker, C-reactive protein, is a better predictor of heart disease than LDL on its own.
Wow.
LDL is a very poor predictor because, again, it needs to be oxidized to even form this atherosclerotic plaque. So what is it? What is it that causes the LDL to be oxidized, right? Let's look into this a little bit. They've actually identified this. They identified the two major components of oxidized LDL. It's called, and it's not really important, but it's interesting, 9 and 13-HODE, H-O-D-E. 9 and 13-HODE are the fundamental marker of an oxidized LDL. they are a byproduct of not saturated fat, of not monounsaturated fat, of linoleic polyunsaturated omega-6 fat, corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, peanut oil, that have been damaged. And so as we actually look at, okay, what is contributing to this cardiac risk, it has almost nothing to do with saturated fat, which saturated fat does raise our LDL cholesterol a very little bit. But they know that it's not LDL cholesterol that is the problem. They know that it's actually what's called small, dense LDL. And this is something they can study, and they can pull from your blood work. Small, dense versions of that LDL, which is oxidized LDL, which contains oxidized unsaturated omega-6 fats. And so they've done studies where they remove linoleic acid, which is these oils, these vegetable oils that we talk about. They do studies where they remove this from the diet. Guess what happens? 9 and 13 HOD decrease, those byproducts, those toxic byproducts, and people don't have these oxidized LDL, in their bloodstream. Did you follow that? Did that all make sense?
It made sense. I think I would need the test to be matching. Mm-hmm. I think I might be able to pass it with multiple choice, but matching I think I could do.
I love it.
It does seem like the overarching premise here is these man-made refined products seem to be more destructive in our body than these natural products.
Yeah,
that's what I'm kind of gathering from this. Like, and it's these like weak bonded polyunsaturated fats seem to be maybe more easily manipulated within the body, mm-hmm. and because of that, they become these, or they have something to do with these foam cells. And then what's so this is all happening in the body, and then how does it become, what kind of, let me put it this way. Where does the clogging come in? Mm-hmm. Back to third grade questions, mm-hmm. right? So, heart disease is this clogging of the arteries, clogging mm-hmm. of the, plaque. Is this plaque, I guess I'm answering my own question, it comes from this plaque, and now is this plaque basically because the cells have foamed and become larger and don't fit or don't travel the same way that the other lay flat kind of stuff does?
And so we don't know, they don't really know how this happens. But the logical conclusion, I think, following a lot of the data that we have is that, these foam oxidized cells, these foam cells, they get lodged into the siding, the endothelial lining of the blood vessel, of the aorta, all these arteries, and over time they stack up. There's also some data that suggests that we have natural immunity to that kind of thing, and it's somewhat natural that this happens. This is, we do have some natural unsaturated omega-6 kind of fats and whatnot, and so maybe that's a part of it too. But there is some natural, apparently, blockage that kind of happens through clotting. And so the idea is we build up some of this plaque, and then we're supposed to clot over that to prevent that from breaking up, and then providing more blockage. And there's some data to suggest that the covering, this shield protectant over the plaque, has something to do with none other than insulin resistance and carbohydrate balance kind of stuff. But nonetheless, it's these foam cells that actually have to attach to these this endothelial lining, and that is fairly well known.
Okay, that makes good sense to me.
So to wrap this up in a way that makes sense, heart disease was the main the main killer in the early 1900s to mid 1900s, and still is. And I mentioned that this kind of popped up soon into the 1900s. Do we want to take a guess as to what was introduced in the 1900s around the time that heart disease was increasing rapidly?
Oh, introduced in I'm going to say something that refined the products that we were already eating even more.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like, I don't know.
In the early 1900s, fat intake increased by 12% in the American diet from vegetable oils. So this vegetable oils were introduced in the early 1900s.
That's when vegetable oils were introduced.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, amazing.
Wow. And that it's such a large industry now,
right?
125 years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the problem has been that we have this data that's kind of background, not highlighted, not given, not appreciated, that is suggestive of, hey, maybe this hypothesis isn't exactly accurate. And, maybe what I'm saying isn't exactly, 100% accurate either, but you guys can look up, and everyone can look up the data and see for yourself, these studies where the largest randomized controlled clinical trial ever shows the exact opposite. So, we have to have an open mind when it comes to these kinds of things. And it's been described as old paradigm versus new paradigm, this old paradigm of health where, people have built their lives around telling people to not eat saturated fat. And it hurts to say, well, maybe that's not actually the problem. And in fact, I think there's a lot of data to suggest that it's not the problem. And they actually, in 2020, this is another little anecdote, they were doing, 2020, 2021, they were doing studies, the veterinarian team on dolphins, actually. And dolphins are an interesting thing to study because they acquire metabolic diseases like humans. And in fact, they seem to acquire them somewhat naturally in their environment. And they look at different subgroups of dolphins, and they find that they have different types of metabolic diseases. I don't know much more than that, but what they did find was that the protective, there was a protective element to some of the dolphin groups, and when they narrowed all of it down, they actually found that there's this saturated fat within a lot of their tissues called C15. The carbon chain is 15 carbons long. And they found that this C15 saturated fat actually protected them against many metabolic diseases. And as they expanded their search into humans, they found that this C15 fat was actually the predominant saturated fat in the tissues of people living in these blue zones, the blue zones of the people who are live for many, many years and have this kind of longevity that seems to surpass the average human. And so now they're starting to find, these saturated fats actually are potentially quite impactful and essential and protective for humans. And C15, where do we find that? We find that in milk, dairy, full-fat cheese, full-fat dairy, all of that kind of stuff that we've avoided for so long.
I know we've already probably triggered our audience a million different ways,
Sorry,
but I
guys.
have one more question before we wrap this up. Talk to me a little bit about salad dressing, because my brain keeps going to fat-free Italian dressing or these dressings that, and I'm literally, I think I'm probably your best audience today because I walked in here with no knowledge of any of this, and now my wheels are spinning enough to say, if I'm eating a salad with no saturated fat and I'm putting on top of it I'm assuming more likely than not, some type of polyunsaturated fat with these oils that are probably not just olive oil, but also soybean and corn and all these other things. Essentially, most of the salad dressings I eat are probably those with herbs.
Yeah. That's unfortunate. That's the big one. Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing is that we're probably all getting a lot of vegetable oils from these salad dressings, which, yeah, again, kind of highlights the fact that you can't remove something, have it be palatable, and still think that you're doing a good job and that you've done something right. And this is not necessarily on us; it's on the fact that this information hasn't been out there and people aren't talking about it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, moderation still persists here. And so we've talked about omega-3s too. And omega-3s actually are a polyunsaturated fat. However, they actually appear to negate the effects of 9 and 13 HOD actually. And so this is stuff that I'm kind of diving into a little bit. Everyone at this point probably knows that I love omega-3s. Omega-3s are highly, highly protective against everything that occurs here. And so if there's any takeaway, get some omega-3s in, add some saturated fat to the diet. This is going to help you out in the long run. There's nothing wrong. They did a big meta-analysis study of studies done literally maybe early this year or late last year. What they found, they took all of this data. They looked at meat eaters, and they found that there was nothing wrong with meat. That in fact, when people ate beef and all that kind of stuff, high-fat beef, there was no risk of mortality. Their LDL was actually the same. There was no issues. And so, we're starting to get a lot of this data, and now it's our job to say, all right, well, this isn't just disappointing. This is just the facts. And so meat is fine. Full-fat dairy seems to be fine. It's actually rich in these saturated fats that seem to be healthful. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense because these are just whole foods. Milk, whole food, cheese, whole food. It's one ingredient. Meat is one ingredient.
I love it.
So
I think that you did an incredible job of teaching me today. I hope that our audience was listening intently as I was, and probably go back and listen to some of that in the middle there again to really just understand. And I if I was delivering that information, I probably would have ran down the rabbit hole of the reasons I think some of this stuff happened, and you did a great job of just keeping it to just the facts. So thank you for that. Like I said, I came in here with no info, and now I could definitely pass at least a matching test.
I love it.
So thank you for that as well.
I love it. Yeah, great. Yeah. So I think it's an important topic. I think fat is misunderstood, and I guess if we wanna learn more about this, you guys can always reach out to me. I'm more than happy to have this discussion. Obviously, I love this topic, and please subscribe, do all the whatever the interactions that we have. That helps out a lot. Give us a follow, all that jazz. Let us know if there are any specific topics you want to learn about or hear our conversation on, and we will catch you next time.